Welcome to Bad Ideas, the show where we look at misfires, mistakes, and miscalculations from all throughout history.
I'm Tony Southcott.
And I'm Albert Berg, and the bad idea for this week is Cleveland.
I mean, that's just a little bit rude to our Midwest brethren.
Well, that was a bit of a joke at Cleveland's expense, Tony, and really, this story comes out of a few too many jokes at Cleveland's expense. This was a city that had been referred to as the mistake by the lake many, many times throughout its history. And in 1986, the people of Cleveland started to get fed up. They were sick of being the rinky-dink little town that nobody cared about. They had big city aspirations, and they were gonna prove to the world that they were an awesome place to live with something called Balloonfest.
I mean, is this like a bunch of people go and have hot chocolate and watch hot air balloons?
That probably would have been a better thing to do, but no, Tony, we're talking about much smaller balloons. We're going to start in the very early morning of September 27th, 1986. And in the wee hours of this day, there are hundreds of high school students sat in this huge structure made of scaffolding and mesh that had been erected in Cleveland's public square. And they were carefully filling and tying off millions of helium balloons in preparation for what would be the single largest release of helium balloons ever. This was Balloonfest, an event that had been organized by the Cleveland chapter of the United Way. And the United Way wanted to boost Cleveland's image and give the people there a reason to be proud of the city they lived in, so they hired a man named Tom Hollowatch. And Tom Hollowatch spent 6 months carefully planning and organizing this event. He had done similar work for Disney on a smaller scale earlier in life, and so he was uniquely talented to set this up, because you can't just release your million balloons one at a time, Tony.
Yeah, there's no excitement there. You got to get some nets and do it that way.
That's correct. And Tom knew about some of this stuff, but he had to innovate, because what Cleveland wanted to do was a balloon release on a scale that even Tom, who had done this as a huge event for Disney in the past, had not ever been exposed to.
Have you ever been to a balloon release?
I have not.
I've been to some at Bronco games where they probably did 50,000, 60,000 balloons. It's a pretty impressive thing whenever they just let it all go, and it's just all throughout your vision. That's all you can see, like over like the entire Denver skyline. It's pretty crazy to see.
It was pretty crazy to see, and we're going to get to that in a minute, but the prep work for this is really sort of where I found the meat of this story, Tony. It's fascinating to read everything they had to do to get this Balloonfest up and going. To start with, they had an entire tanker truck full of helium on site, with snaking rivers of copper pipes going out throughout this special structure that they had built, and these weird little upside down milk crate things that they stuck the valves up through that you would inflate the balloons with. They had all of this down to assembly line precision. The net at the top of this enclosure that they had built out of scaffolding was sourced from a company that made similar netting for the space shuttle. They had literal space-age materials that they had to source to release this many balloons. Because you can imagine, like, if it's a super heavy net, it's going to hold the balloons down. You want something that's going to sort of pull back as the balloons push it up and let the balloons free. So it had to be light, but also very strong. The structure itself was 250 by 150 feet, and it stood 3 stories high. Not only that, but the city codes require that this thing be built to the same code required for permanent structures. So they had to get an engineer on site and build this thing so that it could withstand up to 90-mile-an-hour winds. Now, I read some interviews with the man who designed all this, Tom Hollowatch, and at the time, as they're designing this, he said, I didn't think there was much need in designing this thing to be able to withstand 90-mile-an-hour winds. That seemed a little bit excessive to me. But I went ahead and did it anyway. There was a civil engineer named Isaac Lewin who took the initial design that Tom had developed from the structure, and he added in structural supports and some extra things to really make it strong enough to withstand what the city code required. And that turned out to be, well, depending on your perspective, Tony, but for the people beforehand at least, very fortunate, because on the night of the release, right before they were about to do this, there was a real bad windstorm that hit Cleveland with 90-mile-an-hour gusts blowing through the streets of Cleveland, and they were not able to take down the structure. So fortunately, this bit of city code saved the Balloonfest.
And not only say the Balloonfest, we would be telling a very probably different story about how people trying to release balloons had an entire scaffolding fall on them.
That's also possible. I don't know exactly what the timing is, but if there were people inside the structure and the wind ripped it up, I would imagine at the very least you would have injuries and possibly deaths from that. The initial plan for this release was 2 million balloons, but the organizers weren't quite able to get to that. They had to rein in their ambition and settle for 1.4 million balloons. And that was still a massive undertaking. The uninflated balloons before they were floating would have weighed, and according to the math that I've done, Tony, based on a 1.7 gram per balloon weight, around 4,200 pounds.
It's a lot of trash.
A lot of trash and a lot of work, but, you know, you feed high schoolers pizza and give a donation to their band, and they'll probably help you with just about anything.
Yep, and I'm imagining they got very, very good at tying balloons.
They did, and as they started to get tired, they pumped in the music. Everybody was hyped up. The city of Cleveland was ready for this awesome sight, Tony, the spectacle that was going to bring them back to national respectability. So, as we mentioned, September 27th, the day appointed, there is a massive scaffold with this net, and it's full of balloons. They're straining at this net, making this huge, colorful mound. It's just aching to reach up to the sky, and at the time appointed, they are released. And I gotta tell you something, I've seen videos of this, and it looks awesome. Especially just like the first few seconds when the balloons go up and they just wrap around this massive building there in downtown Cleveland. And it almost looks like something out of a horror movie. The balloons that, but in a good way, like in a cool sort of over the top fun. I mean, you know that, or at least you're hoping that everything's going to be safe. All these balloons just pouring into the sky, and all these thousands of Clevelanders were on hand to watch, and they just ate it up. It was the best thing they'd ever seen. They were having a great time, and the balloons just filled the sky. It was like a colorful new kind of man-made weather. And the story could have ended there, Tony. Happily, with a sense of wonder and human accomplishment. And unfortunately, the weather was not done with Balloonfest. And so off of Lake Erie comes this cold front pushing a storm system right into the balloons. And there's cold air and there's rain. And what happens is, between the cold air counteracting the lift of the balloons and the rain falling on top of them, these balloons, within an hour of being released, are being pushed back down to Earth and just getting in the way of everything. When they were soaring majestically into the sky, the balloons were a spectacle, but now that they were blanketing the ground and the water of Lake Erie, they've become an eyesore. Now, there is an environmental concern here that is almost achingly obvious, and I want to point out that the organizer of the event had thought of the fact that the balloons had to come down somewhere. The problem was, the balloons that they bought had been marketed as biodegradable, and latex balloons are technically biodegradable. But biodegradable does not mean falls apart within an hour after touching the water. And these balloons in the wild could last up to 4 or 5 years without breaking down sufficiently. So it was still an environmental disaster. They thought that they were safe, but in fact, the balloons got in a lot of stuff and stayed there for a while.
I mean, that sounds like so much, like 4,200 pounds of trash. I guess for a city, that's not very much. But to just spread all this into a lake where you've got tons of fish and tons of their like economy, like relies on being able to ship through there and everything, that just sounds like a horrible idea.
A lot of it also goes across the lake to Canada.
Our first attack since the War of 1812.
Apparently, yes. So they weren't super happy with us. Beyond that, the low-flying balloons spooked a woman's prize horse into injuring itself on a nearby fence, and she sued the United Way of Cleveland for $100,000. They settled out of court, so we don't know how much she got, but one would assume it was a decent chunk of change. However, the worst damage done by Balloonfest was the death of 2 boaters who got caught in the same storm that grounded the balloons. And the horrific part of this was that they called for help, and the Coast Guard was on hand to try to rescue them. But the problem was they were in the water surrounded by lots and lots of floating balloons and also balloons that were floating on the surface of the water. And the Coast Guard helicopter had their vision obscured first by the balloons in the air, and then also had a hard time looking for human heads poking up out of the water that is full of helium balloons that also are about the same shape as a head.
Yeah, I think I'd be trying to like stuff those like into my shirt and everything to float, but I'm not sure how long that would actually be sustainable.
I'm sure these guys tried to live, Tony, but they did not. And one of these men's widows sued for over $1 million for his death, and again it was settled out of court, but again it probably cost United Way in Cleveland quite a bit of money. This event was so disastrous that the Guinness Book of World Records, who was on hand to record this as the most balloons released ever in the history of the world, they retired that category after 1986 because they didn't want anybody trying this again and possibly having even worse effects on the environment and human life. And
That's one way not to be culpable for it.
I guess so. The sad thing is, when I went back and researched this, I could not help but be amazed by this incredible achievement of technology and engineering. It's just, unfortunately, weather is bigger than technology and engineering, and nature does things that you're not planning for. Beyond that, even, is the fact that helium is a scarce resource. And this is something that I've seen in the researching for this podcast. A lot of people dunking real hard on the people involved in this balloon release. And you have to give them a little credit because they did not know at the time. It was not heavily publicized that there was this sort of helium shortage that we have on Earth. But there's only so much helium. Now, granted, yes, helium is the second most abundant substance in the universe. However, a lot of that is stuck inside of stars where it's kind of hard to get to. The helium that we have on Earth is somewhat limited. We mine it out of caves, and once it goes up into the atmosphere, once you release a helium balloon, that helium is essentially gone forever. There is no cost-effective way to get that helium back. And so the amount of helium we have right now is the amount of helium we're probably going to have for the foreseeable future, and it's not a great idea to just be throwing it away with cool displays to make your city feel better because they suck.
Yeah, and also like the process of making more helium out of hydrogen is a little bit explosive.
Yes, they call that fusion. Maybe we can get some fusion reactors at some point, Tony, but not yet. It's still way too hot.
So what's the bad idea this week?
Well, there's a couple of obvious ones. First of all, there's the environmental impact, which I think was taken into account at the time, but not completely planned through. And I think it would have been less important, less of an impact on the environment if the balloons hadn't all come down in the same place. If you'd been able to spread them out, then I think it wouldn't have been as big of a deal. But as it was, all these balloons in one place, I can't imagine it was great for Lake Erie. And the other bigger one was just the short-sighted nature of releasing all of this helium into the air for what is essentially spectacle.
And not a very long-lived spectacle either.
No, even if it had gone as planned, the fact is there are many technological and sort of important to actual life uses for helium that aren't balloons, and the more we have for those, the better.
So you're saying I should feel really guilty anytime I suck down a helium balloon to make my voice be funny?
You shouldn't feel really guilty, but you should think about it. You should have it in your mind that this helium is never coming back, and maybe we're going to need it in the future sometime.
But it graced my vocal cords, so it had a good purpose.
Well, there you go, Tony. All is forgiven. And now, in honor of Balloonfest, I'm going to do the outro in helium voice.
That's it for this week, folks. Thank you so much for listening. If you like the show, tell a friend about it. Check us out on Patreon at patreon.com/humanechoes. Don't forget, if you have ideas for bad ideas that you would like us to cover, you can send them to badideiasshow@gmail.com or to our Twitter, humanechoes@twitter.com. We'll see you guys next week.
Bye.
Next week.
Bye.
Next week.